This is a significant debate. In fact, I think it is probably the significant debate. It is part of a national dialogue, the Great God Debate, some people are calling it. And the question has been debated for literally thousands of years. And given that fact, obviously in light of the 1-hour format that we have, we're not going to be able to cover this issue in toto. But we're certainly going to be able to look at some aspects of this. A thumbnail sketch, more to the point, surrounding this debate. But what you will hear will help you identify some of the issues that are in fact swirling around this debate. And as the book of Jude said in the final analysis, this will help us all contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. A number of prominent atheists have become New York Times best-selling authors with books like God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, Letter to a Christian Nation by Sam Harris. In fact, Sam Harris said something very interesting when he really articulated this new, if I might be so bold, more aggressive form of atheism. He said, if the basic doctrine of Christianity is correct, I have misused my life in the worst conceivable way. I admit this without a single caveat. The fact that my continuous and public rejection of Christianity does not worry me in the least should suggest to you just how inadequate I think your reasons for being a Christian are. Well, Christopher Hitchens, in a Washington Post op-ed dated July 14th of last year, described faith in God as, quote, a delusion that we have been created diseased by a capricious despot and then abruptly commanded to be whole and well on pain of terror and torture. That sick joke is one that we can cease to find impressive, that belongs in the infancy of our species and gives a false picture of reality that we would do well to outgrow. Well, with that as a quick way of background, let me introduce to you our very august debaters. They are both very great minds, and we are extremely fortunate to have both of them with us. They have literally trod the halls of academia from Caltech to Harvard University. So we do so appreciate their being with us. Let me start first, if I may, please, with Dr. Michael Shermer, who's the founding publisher of Skeptic magazine. He's also the executive director of the Skeptic Society. He is a monthly columnist for Scientific America. He's the host of the Skeptics Distinguished Science Lecture Series at Caltech and an adjunct professor of economics at Claremont Graduate University. He's the author of several books, including Why People Believe Weird Things, Why Darwin Matters, Evolution, and the Case Against Intelligent Design, The Science of Good and Evil, and his latest book, quite literally hot off the presses, and Michael, I do thank you for a copy. It is called The Mind of the Market, and the subtitle is most intriguing, Compassionate Apes, Competitive Humans, and Other Tales of Evolutionary Economics. A little bedtime reading, eh, Michael? Thank you very much for that. And also, let me introduce Dinesh D'Souza, who is a very well-known writer and a speaker with his articles appearing quite literally in every major newspaper and magazine in the country. He was a former policy analyst in the Reagan White House and a fellow at both the American Enterprise Institute and the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He is a very prolific author, and his books include the best-selling The End of Racism, including Ronald Reagan, How an Ordinary Man Became an Extraordinary Leader, The Virtue of Prosperity, What's So Great About America, Letters to a Young Conservative, The Enemy at Home, and of course the book that became the catalyst for our discussion today, What's So Great About Christianity. Gentlemen, I welcome you both. Would you welcome our guests formally, please? Now, let me tell you, as great scholars and academicians in their own right, they're much more used to a format where they really get to dig deep, 25 minutes per se to a question. So I reminded both of our good gentlemen here that we are predominantly broadcasters. We work on a tight clock. So they have both agreed to a very, very controlled format, and I want to thank them publicly for that. Each question will allow each participant 3 minutes to respond and then an additional 1 minute to rebut. We also have some of your questions we hope to fold into this discussion as well. And gentlemen, I give you my public and forthright promise to be fair and even-handed to both of you. Let the games begin. On the whole, has Christianity been more of a force for good or a force for evil in the world? And likewise, has atheism been more of a force for good in the world or a force for evil? Dinesh, I start with you, please.
Well, I'm honored and delighted to be here. The last time Michael Shermer and I debated, we were at Caltech, which was hostile territory for me. In the name of fairness, I invited Michael here. Janet didn't warn me that we would have these rather unusual podiums. I'm very relieved I remembered to wear pants. I don't know how I can summarize my argument in 3 minutes. I guess I'm going to try to adopt the motto that King Henry VIII used with one of his wives. He said, "I won't keep you very long." I think as religious broadcasters, you face a very new and kind of unusual challenge. In previous eras, you were broadcasting to an audience that largely shared Christian assumptions. There were certain things that you could take for granted. People believe in an external moral order. People accept the authority of Scripture. The problem is that we are living in a society in which secular assumptions have come to the forefront. I think as Christians we have got to learn for the first time perhaps to be bilingual. And what I mean by that is to speak, if you will, a more religious language in church, but also learn to speak a more secular language when addressing people who don't share Christian beliefs and assumptions. There's no point in appealing to the authority of Scripture to someone who says, "I don't accept that authority to adjudicate the question that we're debating." Now, we're facing also a new and aggressive atheism that goes beyond the desire to take down the Christmas creche or bring the Ten Commandments down from the public square. This is a new atheism that attacks religion in general and specifically Christianity, arguing that it's had a terrible influence in the world. The new atheism has been helped by 9/11. I was recently reading an article by a fellow who said, look at 9/11, that was a kind of faith-based initiative. There's an attempt to equate, for example, Islamic radicalism on the one side with Christianity on the other, both as forms of fanaticism. And the new atheists will point to history. They'll say, look around the world, the reason people kill each other and go to war, the Israelis and the Palestinians, the Hindus and the Muslims, the Shia and the Sunni, it's because of religion. Religion is a pernicious influence in history. And then they point to the Crusades and the Inquisition and the religious wars and so on. I want to make two very brief points this afternoon. And the first one is that very often in this critique of religion and Christianity, we tend to forget that most of the key institutions and ideas and values of Western civilization, including the values that secular people and atheists cherish. I'm sure Michael Shermer made a list of some of the things that he values the most. The idea of the individual, the equal dignity of women, the abolition of slavery, compassion as a social virtue. These values were brought into the world by Christianity. How do we know this? We only have to look to other cultures where these values are de-emphasized or they're not valued at all. If you look to ancient Greece and Rome before Christianity, the Spartans notoriously would take the sick child and leave it on the hillside in the winter to see if it was still alive in the morning. That's not the shocking thing. The shocking thing is that the great thinkers of ancient Greece, Aristotle, Plato, knew about this, but regarded it with complete equanimity. It was to them no big deal. And why? Because the value of human life was simply not cherished in those civilizations. That came with Christianity. I want to make now a point, if I may, about science, because very often we think of science as based on reason and religion as based on faith. But science, too, is based on a certain kind of a faith, and that is the faith that the universe is orderly, the fact that the universe is lawful, the fact that our minds in here can apprehend the rationality of the universe out there. Now, if you're a religious believer, all of this makes sense to you. You say, we believe God is omniscient. He created a rational universe. God is a lawgiver. He gave us the moral law, the Ten Commandments, and so on. So he also gave us the physical laws. And finally, we are created in God's image, and so we have within us a spark or hint of the divine rationality that enables us to understand the world out there. But this, you can only make these assumptions if you're a theist, if you're a religious person. If you're an atheist, you simply have to take it 100% on faith. A final point, if I may, and that is that if you look at the influence of religion in the world and in history, there's a lot of emphasis on the crimes of religion. Often those crimes are wildly exaggerated. In fact, they're so exaggerated that even religious people come to believe them. If you had asked me a few years ago how many people were killed in the Inquisition, I would say I don't know, but it's a big blot on Western history, maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe millions. In fact, there's now a body of scholarship on the Inquisition, and if you look at it more closely, you see that over 350 years, the Spanish Inquisition killed about 2,000 people. Now that's 2,000 too many, and I'm not exactly a math major, but let's see, 2,000 people over 300, that's about 6 guys a year. It doesn't, to me, qualify as a world historical crime. Meanwhile, atheist regimes, Mao in China, Stalin in Russia, Pol Pot in Indochina, have killed literally tens or hundreds of millions of people. You have an ocean of blood and a mountain of bodies that have been produced by atheist regimes in the name of atheism. So I think when you weigh things, when you look at them objectively, and even in a secular way, using reason and science and evidence, you see that the worldview of theism, and specifically Christianity, does make a lot of sense. And when we look at our civilization, founded on Athens and Jerusalem, I think even those of us who are not religious, even Michael Shermer, can go down at least on one knee and say at the end of the day, thank God for Christianity. Thank you very much.
Michael, your response, please.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to bend down on a knee or not today. We'll see on that. Well, anyway, thanks so much for having me here. It's great. Flew into Nashville yesterday and drove up the interstate, and I noticed on the right side there, coming up into the area here, there was a huge, it was probably either Presbyterian or Baptist, I couldn't quite tell right there, and I thought, oh my gosh, the people of Tennessee do not apparently believe in the separation of church and interstate. Anyway, so now that the writer's strike is over, this is the only place I can use my material. Anyway, so I was once a born-again Christian. I went to Pepperdine University in Malibu there and to study theology, and I did what we called witnessing. That is Amway with Bibles. We would go around and tell people about Jesus and God and so forth. So I took this fairly seriously, and then later I became something of a born-again atheist, I suppose, and went around to those same houses and knocked on the doors and said, I take it back, and really, and I don't like the labels too much. I suppose a bumper sticker I saw once when I was in Dayton, Tennessee to visit the place of the Scopes monkey trial said, militant agnostic, I don't know and you don't either. And maybe something like that represents it. I don't know. The whole thing sort of reminds me of what you get when you cross a Jehovah's Witness with an atheist, and that's somebody who knocks on your door for no reason at all. And the labels are problematic. I think the answer to the question, is religion a force for good or evil, is yes. I mean, it depends. I think one of the things I liked about, you met Harvey Papel and his publishing this book, Bondage of the Mind. I think the strong point there is not that religion is the problem, it's fundamentalism, by which he means, and by which I would mean, extremism of any kind is the problem, especially if you have the power to do something about it, to enforce your will on other people politically through violence. That's the problem. And so to the extent that religion does good, it's good. When religion does bad, it's bad. It just depends on the context and who's doing what to whom. And so to that extent, I don't really care what somebody believes as long as they employ the principle of freedom and liberty. That is, I should have the freedom to believe or disbelieve what I want, and so should you, as long as we don't interfere with each other's freedoms. And unfortunately, there are others in the world who don't honor the principle of liberty and freedom, as the president was talking about this morning. And the only thing I suppose I disagree with him there, by the way, I'm a conservative atheist. I think there's only two of us, me and Christopher Hitchens. And The only thing I would disagree there, the idea, it's something of a platitude, I suppose. Liberty is a God-given right. It sure doesn't look like it. Historically, you pretty much just have to fight for it, and it can be taken away at any moment. And so, eternal vigilance is the cost of freedom. Anyway, so and I wanted to make a few comments about the rise of the so-called new atheism or the militant atheism. These guys, Chris Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and so forth, Sam Harris, are good friends of mine. And I know from where they're coming because I'm there too, and we travel in the same circles. And if you go to an ACLU meeting, they'll show a film just like the one you saw here from the ADF. That says pretty much the same thing. You know, on every front we're besieged by attacks on freedom and so forth, and we have to gather the troops and raise some money. And all groups do that, wave the red meat in an alarmist way in order to gather the support of their members. And unfortunately, we are tribal by nature. We evolved in these small groups in which, within our groups, we're fairly moral, pro-social, altruistic, cooperative, nice. Between groups, we can be fairly nasty, tribal, xenophobic. And unfortunately, I think you see some of that going on here. Post 9/11 and the rise of the evangelical right into modern politics, I think has tilted the pendulum off to another way that makes those of us who don't believe feel a little besieged, it's a little too much in your face, if I can be blunt. That's what makes people like Chris Hitchens and Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, myself, others, write the things we write. It's like, enough already. We know what you believe. Just leave us alone. And unfortunately, that isn't always the case. The latest stats on this, by the way. There's about 10% of us that have no belief in God at all in America, and another 10% who are what the sociologists call unchurched. That is, they don't belong to any faith or church. They have no commitment to any religion at all. That's 20%. That's 60 million Americans. So when somebody like Mitt Romney gives his famous religion speech and he says, if I'm president, I'll represent people of all faiths, 60 million Americans are listening to this going, excuse me, you just left out, 60 million people. So I guess I would only ask those of you in the religious broadcasting community, don't forget there's a lot of us out there. This would account for why Dawkins' book, for example, sold 1.3 million in hardback. There's a market for those of us who feel a little besieged. And whether we're really besieged or not, well, we live in America. We're all pretty well gifted with freedom and protection and so on compared to other parts of the world. I think it is that natural tribalism we have to watch out for. And if that was the only message I had today, it would be that if any time in history where we really need to watch out for those natural xenophobic tribalisms, including between us non-believers and you believers, this would be a good time to find some common ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Well, gentlemen, because both of you exceeded the 3 minutes, I will take away the 1 minute rebut, okay. And I will, at this point of privilege for the moderator, let you know, Michael, to the marrow of our bones, we will continue to remember those 6 million atheists. And that's why we'll make sure the fairness doctrine never gets put into place. So thank you very much. All right, as a prelude to the next question, Sam Harris, whom I mentioned earlier, has said this. The choice between us is simple. We can either have a 21st century conversation about morality and human well-being, a conversation in which we avail ourselves of all the scientific insights and philosophical arguments that have been accumulated in the last 2,000 years of human discourse, or we can confine ourselves to a first century conversation as it is preserved in the Bible. Why would anyone want to take the latter approach? Michael, first to you, and then Dinesh, you respond. And gentlemen, if you can, I know these are big questions to be limited to 3 minutes, but if we could. Michael, let me start with you. The question is simply this then. Can people be good without God?
Well, obviously, lots of people who have, well, I just said 60 million Americans have no, say half that are atheists or agnostics. 30 million have no belief in God. And there's no data statistically from the people that study sociology of religion morally between believers and non-believers. There's no measure anyone's ever had that non-believers get divorced more often or have more affairs or lie more, or cheat more in business or anything like that. Not a shred of evidence for that. And you can go to George Barna, who is an evangelical Christian pollster who studies these things. So I'm not picking out the ACLU data, I'm picking out the evangelical data in which that is the case. So in practice, no, there's no difference. And In principle, why should there be any difference? Because I agree with you that there is in our human nature the capacity for great moral sentiments. That is, we have moral emotions. We feel guilt when we violate social relationships. We feel pride and joy when we help people in an altruistic, pro-social way. We have these capacities. I happen to think that they evolved because we're a social species that has to have these capacities. I mentioned earlier how tribal we are. Those moral capacities mostly exist within groups. Between groups, as we all know, as we can see, we're very xenophobic and tribal. And so there, in that sense, in sort of a group competitiveness, that's the dark side of our human nature. So, and you already agree with this. You just put different labels on it. The labels don't matter. You can say good or evil or original sin. My only problem with original sin at this point is I can't think of any. They've all been taken. Anyway.
Bada boom.
All right, I'll give up the ghostwriting thing. And so, just like nobody today would make the argument that we need God to explain the workings of the solar system. We have a perfectly good grounded theory on physics and cosmology and the condensing cloud of interstellar gas that forms solar systems. Nobody says, God did it. We all know how it happened naturally. And believers just say, well, that's how God set up the universe to operate this way, and we're all on the same page there. There's no conflict. Why not just say that same argument? Evolution is simply the way God created the amazing and wonderful diversity of life. Instead of seeing science as a conflict, a challenge, a threat to your faith, just see it as a way of illuminating God's creation. And this is the way God did it. So I would argue the moral sentiments, Dinesh and I believe most of the same things. We're both conservative. And so I think those came about through evolution. If that's the way God did it, that's fine with me. I have no conflict there.
Thank you, Michael. Dinesh, can people be good without God?
Yes, they can, but even though they can be good without God, in a certain sense, they will be standing on a theistic foundation that they are unaware of. So in other words, if there was a big famine next week in Rwanda and 500,000 people were in danger of dying, what would happen? Right away, something very interesting would happen, and that is that the Western nations of the world would be suffused with indignation and horror and a sense that we should send packages of food. International agencies would be deployed, the Red Cross, church organizations would be unleashed, and so on. Now, if you look around the world, you'll notice that there may be a reaction from other cultures, but it will tend to be less. You will not have a comparable outpouring of compassion. Why is that? Well, it seems to me that what's happening within the West is that within Western culture you have the ingrained influence of Christianity. Even Michael Shermer is a product, in a sense, of a Christian education and Christian values. Now, he's sort of like the guy who's climbed up the ladder and is now trying to kick it out from under him, but his behavior, his values, cannot be explained in evolutionary terms. Why? Because in evolutionary terms we should help people who share our genes. If my wife jumps into a burning car to save our 13-year-old daughter, that can be given a Darwinian explanation. They share a lot of their genes in common. My wife is trying to protect, if you will, her gene pool. On the other hand, if there's some guy dying in Rwanda, he or she is nothing to me. Why should I write a check for even $1? I don't have any genes in common with that guy. So right away, the notion of tribalism, which Michael himself stresses, is insufficient to explain the human kindness that we extend to people who are nothing to us. I would argue that there's a new doctrine that comes into play, and that is the idea of universal brotherhood, the idea of universal equality. Now, where's the Darwinian basis for that? Apes don't respect that. That comes out of the idea that we are created equal in the eyes of God. And because we are created equal in the eyes of God, it follows every human being has dignity. We should treat even people who are strangers to us with respect, and so on. So what I'm suggesting here is that there is, even in the behavior of the secular guy, a Christian foundation that is not being acknowledged.
Michael, a 1-minute rebuttal, please.
Well, I guess I would say that the reason I would be good to somebody who I am not related to, so I'll just give you the brief evolutionary explanation. So why you would be good to your own kin and kind is called kin selection. That is, I am actually getting my genes into the next generation by helping people that are genetically related to me. What about those who are not genetically related to me, but are members of my group? Well, in these groups in which we evolved in these small hunter-gatherer communities of a couple dozen to a couple hundred individuals, everybody knows one another quite well. And like a small town, you know who you can count on and who you can't count on. You know who's a trustworthy, honest person and who's a deceptive liar and a manipulator. And so we learn that through gossip and communication. What we're looking for there is something called reciprocal altruism. That is, I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch mine. But that only works over a long haul if you actually are a moral person. You can't just fake it. You can't manipulate it. You can fool some of the people some of the time, but only a short period of time. If people get to know you and they know what you're really like, then they'll see through the deception. So what I'm arguing is that you actually have to be moral. You have to live it, believe it, think it. It becomes part of your being and your nature. In order to signal to everybody else in the group, I'm a good group member. You can count on me. And so I would say that is part of our nature.
Dinesh, 1 minute.
The concept of reciprocal altruism will explain why I would be nice to someone if I expect some future benefit from them. So for example, if a businessman says, I won't cheat a customer, you can explain that by the fact that the businessman wants the guy to come back and buy again at the same store. On the other hand, it doesn't explain the random acts that we perform every day. If I get up to give my seat in a bus to a 72-year-old woman, that's not a cunning scheme to make sure she gives me her seat next week. Or if I donate blood, I'm doing it not because of some Machiavellian calculation, but basically because I'm a kind of a nice guy. Mother Teresa, you can say, well, really, ultimately, Mother Teresa is really can't fake being good, so she's only being good for some sort of cunning reason. See, I don't think this does justice to human morality. And even Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion admits, he says that a lot of these things have to be put down to pure disinterested altruism. And that's the key phrase, because if such a thing as pure disinterested altruism exists, then the Darwinian framework is inadequate.
Thank you, Dinesh. All right, question number 3, gentlemen. Sorry, Michael. We're going to cast our eyes heavenly. And Dinesh, I'm going to start with you, and I want to give a quote from Michael in his most recent edition of Skeptic Magazine. And he said this: "Shall we then abandon all hope of a paradisiacal state? No. Paradise is here. It is now, it is within us and without us. It is in our thoughts, it's in our actions, it's in our lives and in our loves. It is in our families and in our friends. It's in our communities and in our world. It is in the courage of our convictions and in our character of our souls. Hope springs eternal, even if life is not." Dinesh?
Wow, I wrote that.
Pardon?
I wrote that?
You
Wow,
did?
That's really
Page
good.
55, latest edition. Wow. Dinesh, what's wrong with that statement?
I think the statement does contain an element of truth, and that is that when we think of transcendence, when we speak of the afterlife, we often think of these concepts as applying entirely to another world. John Milton in Paradise Lost speaks about the Christian having within him a paradise within thee, happier far. And in some ways what he's talking about is he says that heaven isn't just out there, it is also in here. One of the most interesting features about Satan, Milton's Satan, is that Satan makes the point that wherever he goes, hell goes with him. Hell is not a place. Hell is where evil and Satan is directly. So I think that the fallacy of the argument is simply this, that we can somehow enjoy a concept of transcendence while cutting off the idea of a source of transcendence. That's the flaw. Because I think Michael and I probably, when pushed to the wall, would agree that there are such things as right and wrong that are not subjective, not just up to the individual. And the question becomes, what is the source? What is the root of these enduring, and in some ways you could say eternal, values? If morality is just something we make up as we go along, you would have prudential rules that vary so much that you could never state enduring principles of right and wrong. But the very fact that those principles exist seems to suggest that there is a moral order in the universe, quite distinct from the laws of physics and quite distinct from us. We didn't create create that order. We merely recognize it as human beings. That, to me, points to transcendence as a social reality in our world even now.
Michael, you wrote those words. You think it's right. Tell us why.
Well, I think we have to separate the question out from metaphorically versus really. That is there really actually a heaven? Is there really some place, or a hell, that you go to? That something after your body is ceased and your brain is decayed that continues on into the ether somewhere? At the moment, we have no evidence for this. This is truly an article of faith. This is really puts the leap into Kierkegaard's leap of faith here. Because what would be the transmission medium? How would you transmit the neural impulses that form your memories into something else that stores those memories, that keeps you going in some other place that we might metaphorically or really call heaven and hell? I think a better way to think about it is metaphorically, that we have a sense of transcendency and spirituality within us. That is something that takes us outside of ourselves, that's bigger than ourselves. The evidence is fairly overwhelming now that people that are spiritual, however you define that, and I don't think religion has a monopoly on spirituality. There's lots of ways to be spiritual. Life is hard enough as it is. Let's not just claim that there's only one way to get through it. And I think there's a lot of ways to do it. For me, it's not through the traditional sources of religion, but I do feel as a spiritual person there are ways to get out of myself by helping others. So I can tie that in with a previous question. That is, for example, I did an adopt a child through World Vision, and when you do that, you go on the web page and they have a little picture of the child and little factoids about it. What's going on there from a scientific point of view is they're tapping into my natural propensity to want to help somebody who's close to me, who I know, who I can see, who matters. Why should we be nice to people that are 9,000 miles away? It's true. It's almost impossible to get people to care about that unless you bring it home with an actual photograph. And what they're doing there is tapping into that. That's a way of being transcendent. That is stepping outside of yourself to help somebody else. I don't see what invoking God as an explanation for that adds anything to the question. Because what's the source, what's God's source for that? Why should we say, tell the truth, or not do abortion, or whatever the moral question is, whatever answer you've come up with? If you think God has given you the answer, how did you get that? Did you talk to him? Did he come to you in a dream? Did you hear a voice? Most people would say, well, no, I don't hear voices. Okay. Then where did you get it? Well, I got it from the book. Unfortunately, the creator of the universe has written many books, and they're not always consistent across cultures of which is the right moral answer to these questions. So at some point, you have to do some reflective thought. And how does that happen? And if you think God did it, did God actually have good reasons for these moral homilies, these moral principles? If there are good reasons, then why do we need God? Why not just invoke the reasons? The reasons are we shouldn't lie because that breaks trust in a social relationship, and you have to have trust in social relationships, excuse me, for them to work. And why not that? Why is that not good enough? What point does it bring to it to add something else when we can simply ask, well, where did God get those moral ideas?
Thank you, Michael. 1 minute response, Dinesh.
Well, I'd like to answer your question. Why God? I think ultimately the belief in God also reflects something very deep within us, which is the desire for cosmic justice in the world. And that is to say, we all know that in the real world we have all these sayings, what goes around comes around and so on, but we know that many times the bad guy ends up ahead, the good guy comes to grief. One of the reasons I think for the strength of belief in God is the idea that at some point there is an ultimate reckoning. We are morally accountable. I also want to make a point about faith and reason. When you say, is there an afterlife? Essentially, Michael Shermer is saying, I don't see any evidence for it. And to some degree, he's right. We can't produce dead people who have come back to life and so on, but this all raises a good question, which is to say, what kind of evidence would convince him? What kind of evidence is he looking for? He is demanding empirical evidence in a domain that's not open to that. It's a little bit like this. If I was dating a woman and deciding if I should marry her, I could say, well, you know, I kind of wonder what life over the next 40 years is going to be like with her, with Janet. Now, the truth of it is, no matter how long you date, there's no way to know. And so I could say, I'm going to be an agnostic. I'm going to wait for the data to come in. The problem with that approach is the data will never be in. Ultimately, the girl will marry somebody else, or you will both be dead. So you have got to make a decision, given the limited information you have on a question vital to your own future, one way or the other. You have to vote yes or no. No abstentions are allowed. Now, Shermer says, I don't know, and therefore I don't believe. I say, I don't know, and yet I believe. What I'm suggesting is we have one thing in common. Both of us don't know. The difference is Michael Shermer thinks his position is based on reason, and my position is based on faith. In reality, both of us are making a leap of faith. I'm making the leap of faith to believe. He is making the equal leap of faith not to believe, only he's confusedly describing that as skepticism.
Michael, instead of giving you the 1-minute rebut, I'm going to let you add it to your response, because it dovetails into what Dinesh just said. And turnabout is fair play. I quoted Michael, now I'm going to quote Dinesh on this next one. This is what your opponent has said in his book, What's So Great About Christianity. Funerals remind us of our own extinction, and the notion that we will one day cease to exist is a source of anxiety and terror. But Paul writes, O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? For Christians, death is a temporal end, but not a final end. The secular person thinks there are 2 stages, life and death, but for the Christian there are 3, life, death, and the life to come. This is why for the Christian, death is not so terrifying. You touched on this a moment ago, Michael. Is there a way in which science can prove or disprove the existence of heaven?
Right, this is a huge problem from a scientist's perspective. let me first say, people often ask me my position on the afterlife, and my answer is, I'm for it. The problem is what I'm for, what I would like to be true, is not always true. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, and those are the things hoped for, and so forth. But so how can we tell the difference between what we would like to be true and what is or is not true in order to make that leap of faith of something that is ultimately not provable? I do think that on a couple of different issues, God's existence, immortality, and free will and determinism, I don't think it's possible for all of us to agree there is a final answer and here's the evidence for it and here's the experiments and significant at the 0.05 level and so forth, and there it is, the definitive study has now been conducted, and there it is, there's God. Short of something like Woody Allen's joke, how about a large cash deposit in a Swiss bank account in my name, that would convince me that there was a God. I've used that line and actually gotten it down to what would be the amount to show me that there really is a God. So I came up with a number, 100 million. 100 million would convince me that there is a God, or Bill Gates really likes me. Okay, so here's the serious problem. From a scientific perspective, we have something called the Null Hypothesis. The Null Hypothesis is that whatever it is you think your claim is, it's not true. Whatever it is, that vitamin C cures colds, whatever it is, it's not true. Now, the burden is on you to prove that it is true through a fixed set of methods of running experiments and statistical analysis to show us that in fact it is true through clinical trials or epidemiological studies. You know the routine. That standard practice would apply to all areas if you want to apply science. So we start with the null hypothesis, there is no God, there is no afterlife. Now, go ahead and make your case. Well, this case has been made for thousands of years, and some believe it and some don't, and there's much disagreement and great debate. Here we are. So at some point, you do need to make a leap of faith or not, and I simply choose not to, not for any particular reason. I guess my skeptical alarm sort of goes off when I really like there to be something, and I really don't have the evidence for it. It makes me try to be skeptical of my own beliefs, and so I guess that's why I come down on that side. I don't feel a need for actually believing that to have joy and fulfillment and a meaningful life in this world. I mean, in fact, if anything, I kind of feel the opposite, that if this is all there is, boy, how important it really is to lead a deep and meaningful life. And by that, I don't mean some hedonistic eat, drink, and be merry for the end is nigh. Because, in fact, all the research shows that that leads to a fairly shallow, meaningless life, and those people that do that are not very happy. But, in fact, doing the sorts of things that religious people do, that is, helping the poor and needy and so forth, I think those things are tapped into by religion through trial and error over many centuries. If those are the kinds of things that are good to do, that make us better people.
Dinesh, 3 minutes.
Well, Michael Shermer says, I kind of would like to believe in the afterlife. And in fact, this reflects a very common theme in atheism, which is that religion is a form of wish fulfillment. Religious people believe what we do because we wish it were true. I want to suggest two things about this. First of all, this argument makes absolutely no Darwinian sense. Because in an evolutionary framework, why would you evolve to believe things that clearly aren't? Imagine if you're a rabbit and you're faced with a lion that's about to eat you. You have to decide, should I run away or not? You might say, well, as a religious rabbit, I believe that I shouldn't run. Why? Because there's another life waiting for me that's even better. And so I'm facing no real danger. I'm only headed to a better future. All rabbits who believe that would be eaten. It's only the rabbit that ran away that would actually survive. Let me make a little bit of put the point in a little different way. Imagine all of us in this room have gathered here because we are weak, we are cowardly, we know that life is tough. This woman here has diabetes, I need to have my hip replaced, and we are trying to invent a religion that would reflect our wish, our hope, for a better life to come. I can totally see how we'd come up with the idea of heaven. Why? Because in this life there's suffering, there's death. In heaven there's no suffering, there's no death. It goes on forever. So I can see us coming up with that one. But I ask you this question. Why would we come up with the idea of hell? Think about it. Hell is a lot worse than diabetes. Hell is even a lot worse than death. So after all, it's much easier, more convenient for us to believe that when life ends, that's it, you turn off the computer and it's the end of it. Why would we invent Christian morality? Look at all these commandments. Thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. If somebody in the audience stood up and proposed the 10 commandments, I personally would strike out 3 of them. So what I'm getting at here is simply this. It doesn't look to me like the Jewish and the Christian religion are the product of wish fulfillment. In some ways, they impose an even sterner view of life, even tougher, harder to face, than the ordinary view, which simply says, here we are, one day we'll be gone, and that's the end of it.
Michael, 1 minute to rebut, please.
Well, the first 3 could go, and then I'd be more in favor of posting them in public places, something like that, because they're irrelevant to a modern society, a ecumenical society like ours. I mean, you know the 3 I'm talking about, right? I mean, if you don't happen to believe that God, then then why should you impose that on us who don't? And that gets back to that tribalism and you know, who's in the majority. Why do people believe in God? Well, this is an interesting question psychologically. I don't think it's just, there is no single answer. Religion and God beliefs are complex. Religion serves all sorts of purposes that I think have to do with social bonding and the links between us and the music and the food and the camaraderie and the warmth and companionship. All that has nothing to do with the bacterial flagellum of a cell or the DNA structure or the fine-tunedness of the universe. I mean, people don't go to church to hear these arguments for God's existence that theologians and scientists like me debate. I think it has little to do with that. And so why would you invent a hell? Well, you know, there's a whole host of things that, from our perspective, some look good, some look bad. Historically, I think there's reasons for having, I think the way we think about the world in terms of black and white, good and evil, up and down, heaven and hell, dark and light, and so on. These are natural ways to sort of parse up the world to make sense of it. We're pattern-seeking animals. We're trying to make sense of the world by finding common patterns. So heaven and hell, simply to me, just sort of fits into that pattern of separating things out.
Thank you, Michael. 1 minute to rebut, Dinesh.
Well, I think, Michael, here you are contradicting yourself because you started out by saying, gee, we can all be good, we can live fulfilling lives, we can be decent, we can be kind without God. Now, a moment ago, you said, how do you explain how God, the idea of God came into the world? Which is a problem for you because more than 90% of people in the world believe in God. So either they are all suffering from mass delusions or perhaps they're right. But your argument is that they believe in God so that they can bond and go to potlucks and stuff like that. But you said earlier that you don't need God for that. So now how do you account for why God came into the picture in the first place? Not just in one culture or two cultures, but as far as we know, Homo sapiens in every part of the planet has this idea of transcendence, has this idea of God. You need a better explanation is what I'm trying to say.
Agency, in a word.
All right, gentlemen, next question, please.
Nope. Okay.
And Michael, you have stated publicly, and you said it again here, so I'm glad I'm not bearing false witness, that you would have, once upon a time, described yourself as a born-again evangelical Christian. You noted to our friends here that you did, in fact, attend Pepperdine University with the intent of becoming a theologian. But let me quote something you've said. Then you, quote, found science. And then you said you switched to psychology and mastered one of the languages of science, statistics. In science, you say, I discovered that by establishing parameters to determine whether a hypothesis is probably right or definitely wrong, it is possible to approach problems in another way. Instead of the rhetoric and the disputation of theology, there was logic and probabilities of science. What a difference this difference in thinking makes. Dinesh touched on this a moment ago. I would love for you to respond now. Are reason and faith mutually exclusive?
Well, no, but again, it depends on the context and the particular question asked. If it's one of these questions that can't be answered by science, and I gave you those three, God, afterlife, and free will determinism, or just say free will, those do require some decision on our part, because it matters which of those you believe in and how you behave, what you do Sunday mornings, for example, something like that. But ultimately, there's no way to prove them one way or the other. And so then we're back to that question, excuse me, of how do we know that there's a God or not? Is there some experiment to run? I can't think of what would account for that, what experiment we could run. In my own case, personally, I'll note that the way belief systems work is that when you're in the belief system, they're coherent, they're internally coherent if it's a fairly well-developed belief system, such that when you're in it, everything makes sense in that context, and when you're not in it, it doesn't make sense. So we'll pick a different subject, like, say, Scientology, which to most of us looks, a little goofy. And Tom Cruise bouncing on the couch there and talking about the evils of psychiatry or whatever. We picture these things, and the silly story about Xenu, the galactic warrior, bringing humans to Earth and all this stuff. And we can sort of laugh at that and call him a cult, but when you're a Scientologist, it all makes sense in that context. Same thing with Mormonism. Mormonism simply has another century over the Scientologists of acceptance and more mainstreaming of their beliefs, and it's fairly internally coherent. For me, being an evangelical, born-again Christian at Pepperdine, in that social milieu, with all of my friends and my girlfriend and so forth, not my family, I wasn't raised religious, this was a sort of a peer group influence belief. But I was serious about it, and all made sense. And then when I went elsewhere, and I had different friends, different girlfriend, whatever, and where religion was simply not part of it. My friends in science were not anti-religious. No one really cared back in the 70s and 80s about any of this science and religion stuff. It almost never came up. Then it didn't really make any sense to me to believe anymore, and the world made perfect sense without God. So I think there is that power of the sociology, psychology of belief that you can't ignore. The number one predictor of what anybody's religious beliefs are and which God they believe in is where they happen to be born on the planet. That should give us pause.
Thank you, Michael. Dinesh, talk about that relationship between reason and faith, please.
Well, historically, it's interesting that modern science, as we know it, developed not globally, but only in one civilization, namely Western civilization. It's also interesting that if you were to make a list of the 50 great scientists of all time, a list that would have people like Copernicus, Kepler, Boyle, Rutherford, Newton on it, you would see that the vast majority of those scientists were theists, and specifically Christian. Not only Christian, but they saw their work as reflecting the handiwork of God, or the signature of the Creator in the creation. So the point made by the new atheists that there's some kind of inherent conflict between science and religion, most of the great scientists of modern times would not have agreed with that statement. I think the religious view can be formulated very much in scientific terms. For example, one physicist, Lee Smolin, describes a sort of God sitting at a desk with 100 different dials, and these dials are all the different physical forces of nature. The gravitational force, the electromagnetic force, the strong nuclear force, the electro-weak force. And basically the question that these scientists are asking is, what if you were to move the dials a little bit? What if the universe had slightly different physical values than it does? If you read Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, he says that if you touch one of the dials and move it, not 10% or 20% or even 1%, but 1 part in 100,000 millionth million. He's talking about the rate of expansion of the universe. If you change that even by the tiniest fraction, we would have no universe and no life. The idea here isn't just that our planet is fine-tuned for human habitation, but the entire universe is. Now, this argument is completely immune to Darwinian attack. So what explanation can there be for why our universe is the way that it is? You can formulate a couple of possible hypotheses. What makes the most sense to believe? I think it makes most sense to believe that the universe has these constants and has been devised in this way, and in fact reflects intelligence. The laws of nature reflect embedded intelligence. It takes all the great scientific minds of our time to excavate or decode the intelligence that is built into nature. Well, if that's what Einstein and Newton and Galileo were doing, excavating the intelligence out of nature or decoding nature, who encoded the intelligence into nature? These are reasonable questions that can be asked in a secular way, and you can formulate possible answers to them. I think that the religious explanation, that creation looks the way it is because it has been intelligently designed by a creator, seems to me a more plausible, a more direct, a more powerfully explanatory account for why we have the things that we have than alternative explanations. So if Shermer has a better explanation, let's hear it right now.
You have 1 minute to rebut with that explanation if you so choose.
Two answers. One is, then by that set of arguments, who or what designed the designer? If you're going to impose a designer argument on the universe as being structured in a certain way, then there had to be something or somebody who designed the designer that was able to do that, and ergo somebody, a super intelligent designer, designed the intelligent designer, and a super duper intelligent designer that designed the super designer, and so forth. This is just a sort of ad infinitum, beg the question argument, and if you say, well, you got to stop the causal sequence somewhere, why stop it at the first step? It doesn't answer anything to say, well, God did it. It's like that Sidney Harris cartoon of the mathematicians at the chalkboard, and he writes in the middle of a bunch of equations, then a miracle occurs, and the other one says, I think you need to be more explicit here in step 2. There's nothing to do with that, a miracle happens, poof, God did it. It doesn't answer anything. It just pushes the answer off to another question. Well, then where did that come from? And then the second part is the universe actually isn't very finely tuned for life at all. There's almost nowhere you can live in the universe. Even in our own solar system, this is about the only place hospitable for life. Most of the history of the universe is 13.7 billion years old. What was God doing the first 13.6999 billion years, waiting around to send us souls and get us started here? Why that whole complete waste of space and time just for us? Naturally, we would like to think that we're that important, but that alone should give us pause, because in fact, that's usually not the case.
Thank you. 1 minute, Dinesh.
If I was walking down the street and I were to see a car or a spaceship or a skyscraper, I would know right away that that car had been intelligently designed. Molecules didn't fly out of the ground and assemble themselves. Someone designed the car. We're not talking here about the Hyundai, let's say. the Nissan Maxima. Now, I don't know who designed it. Probably some guy in Japan. But now let's consider Michael Shermer's rebuttal to the argument. He goes, well, that's an invalid argument, Dinesh, because if you say some Japanese guy designed the Maxima, who designed the Japanese guy? Well, I think we're trying to explain how we see all around us evidence of intelligence. We see it in other human beings. That's because we have brains. But we see intelligence mysteriously imprinted on matter. And that's odd. As one scientist puts it, how does the electron know what to do? We have matter that obeys scientific laws, E equals mc squared. So the question becomes, when we as human beings recognize intelligence, doesn't that intelligence require an intelligent source? This is the force of what I'm trying to say. To then ask who made God is a different kind of debate, because then it asks, we're talking about matter. We know that matter doesn't automatically assemble itself into intelligent ways. Whether God needs to be independently designed, that's a different argument. I want to make a separate point. You say that there's a big universe, an old universe, a very large universe, and isn't it interesting and strange that this is the only place that we seem to have found life? Well, far from this being a refutation of the religious worldview, it's a stunning confirmation of it. In other words, if life was popping up all over the place, then it would seem to be easily explained as the product of matter interacting upon itself. But if in this vast, old, large universe, as big and as old as it is, the only place that we find life, at least as far as we know, is here, that would seem to suggest a conspiracy. That would seem to suggest that someone is up to something. And so that's all I'm trying to say, is that our presence here in a universe that by all accounts should have nothing in it is mysterious and requires some explanation. The human desire for transcendence arises out of trying to think through these questions. Because science can't answer them doesn't mean that there are no answers.
Gentlemen, a question in a different direction, if I may. Michael, in a Salon.com interview, you said the following: America is based on a diversity of beliefs and was founded on the principle of religious freedom. The conservatives want to blend public life with private life, but religion is private. It's nobody's business. Politicians have to announce they believe in God and God bless America, but religion as public policy leads to a reduction of liberty and freedom for those who don't believe. So, Michael, starting with you, please, first. In light of those comments, do you believe that conservative biblical Christianity poses a threat to the future of America?
When it's in public, when it's pushed on in public life of those of us who are not biblical literalists or fundamentalists or evangelicals or anything like that, absolutely. The best thing that ever happened for religion in the modern world was America and the separation of church and state, such that you have to make it on your own. You're not going to get government subsidies anymore. You have to make religion relevant to your customers. And look what's happened to religion in Europe versus here. It's dead there because they get tax subsidies. It's alive here because churches make themselves relevant to people, just like any company would have to make their products and services relevant. The best thing that ever happened for you was to keep government out of religion. So by trying to cross that boundary, I understand why you want to do it. Anybody who's in the majority, of course, wants to have legislation passed that favors their religion. Everybody would want that. But run the thought experiment forward just for, say, a century. Let's say we pass legislation that it's okay for the government to give special favors and privileges to the dominant religion. And in a century, Islam is the dominant religion of America. You still want those laws on the book that says Muslims get special privileges over you, Christians? You sure you want those laws on the books? I think you should think that through carefully. Keep them separate.
Dinesh.
Well, it seems to me that a bunch of things here are being confused. Religious freedom is being cited as synonymous with separation of church and state. I think you're also confusing theology on the one hand with morality on the other. I think the founders recognized that in a religiously diverse society where claims of revelation cannot be argued in the public square, because ultimately you can never convince someone by saying, God told me. So, for example, the Trinity, which lies in the domain of revelation, doesn't belong in the American public square. On the other hand, there is the whole domain of morality that may be derived from religion, but can be completely defended and articulated in rational terms. The argument for the family, the skepticism about gay marriage, these are moral arguments that can be made even to people who don't agree. There is absolutely no reason to exclude those from the public square. In fact, if you look at the debates in the founding, the founders deliberately excluded theology in order to make room for morality. They recognize that what is a democratic society but an argument about how we should live together. In every other domain, for example, look, we have a public square, and essentially what the atheists are trying to convince us is this, and that is that the way to keep this public square neutral is to take all religious beliefs and empty them out of the public square. Well, that's not neutrality. That leaves the public square to be the monopoly of secular people and atheists. The question, I think, more reasonable and fair to ask is, how do people who are religious and non-religious share the public square? How can we be, in a sense, fair to all citizens and give us equal access to make these moral arguments in the public domain without, in a sense, trying to preemptively strike at the religious argument and say, because it's religious, it doesn't belong here. That effectively disenfranchises not just a minority of 20%, but perhaps the majority of 80%.
1 minute, Michael, to rebut.
Let me note parenthetically that atheism isn't a thing. It isn't anything. It's just a lack of belief in God. That's it. There's no foundation, set of principles, nothing like that. So it's not like we atheists are trying to impose atheism on anybody. There isn't anything even to impose. Okay. We have the unfortunate circumstance that the creator of the universe has written several books, of which different people adhere to different books. And they're not always internally consistent. And they're certainly not consistent between these books that give us moral principles. Obviously, the only way to settle that is through a liberal democracy in which we have debate and we vote on these things and so forth. So to that extent, of course, moral issues, abortion and rights to life and stem cell research, immigration, all these things have to be debated. The problem is where you cross the boundary in imposing one particular set of moral principles from a book that other people who believe in different books, or none of the books, don't believe. And then finally, I think, back to why the rise of the new atheism, I think one of the things that bothers us is the sort of free pass that religious claims get in our culture that no other claims get. Claims about supernatural interventions into this world by the deity, that the savior of the universe was born of a virgin, that the Book of Mormon was dictated by the angel Moroni on gold tablets in reformed hieroglyphics that Joseph Smith found in his backyard in Palmyra, New York, and translated them by putting his face in a hat that had magic stones in it. Why are we not allowed to ask Mitt Romney, do you actually believe this story? And you want to be the president of the United States and you believe this story without any evidence at all? So that's the kind of thing that bothers us. If Mitt Romney said, the problem with illegal immigration, all those Mexicans coming across the border, I'm going to pray about it and God will build an invisible fence. How long do you think that argument would last on the Bill O'Reilly show? See, O'Reilly would not give him a pass on that. But if he says, I think my Savior was born of a virgin, you get the pass. Why is that? Why can we not have that kind of challenge?
Dinesh, 1 minute to respond.
Well, first of all, I think he should be able to be asked that question. I don't think the question, and particularly if Romney was making the argument, which I've never heard him make, that Mormon theology was the basis of his policies on any issue, whether it be tax cuts or immigration or the war, I think then that would be a fit subject for debate. Look, I think that really the opposite is true. Far from religion being given a free pass, religious claims are given a scrutiny and a definition that is not applied in other areas. Here's what I mean by this. If you have a school teacher, let's say, in Nashville, who in a public school decides, I'm going to identify my 10 favorite students and give them a copy of the Bible. Right away, the argument would be, he can't do this. He's an instrument of the state. The Constitution says you shall have no establishment of religion by any organization of the state participating in a religious activity, which handing out a Bible would be. Let's say he says, read this and believe it. This would be considered subsidizing religion and therefore forbidden by the Constitution. But in every other area of life, government undertakes all kinds of activities that are not considered to be establishment at all. For example, the government routinely gives subsidies to farmers. And we don't hear the ACLU saying, by doing this, and this is on the national level, every year. We're not talking about one school teacher in one school district. No one says, we have established farming as our national occupation. We have privileged farming above all other occupations and made other people practicing other professions feel like second-class citizens. No, in the give and take of democratic debate, the farmers had better lobbyists and they've got some subsidies. That's what democracy means. But somehow when it comes to religion, all of this give and take is out the window, and suddenly the smallest hint of expressing a religious view, even in a symbolic way, a moment of silence, is seen as scary, threatening. I think that this reflects ultimately a bogus history and an irrational fear that the slightest succumbing even to symbolic religion will in some way be a prelude to the witch trials and the Inquisition. This is part of an historical argument that has been drummed into our heads, and it's going to take some intellectual spade work to undo it. The premise itself is false.
Gentlemen, if I may, let me ask you a last question, and I will take away the 1-minute rebut so that you'll have an opportunity for closing remarks. The two of you have been debating questions of faith and science on college campuses literally all across the country, and similar debates with other experts are also flourishing as well. So, Dinesh, if I may, let me start with you. At this point in history, do you believe your side of the God debate is winning or losing? And if so, why or why not?
I think that two things are happening simultaneously. One is that worldwide, religion is winning. And when I say religion is winning, all the major religions of the world are growing. Many people think Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. It's not true. Islam is mainly spreading through Muslims having large families. Christianity is the fastest growing religion in the world, spreading rapidly in Africa, in Asia. So worldwide, I think religion is doing very well, and specifically Christianity. The idea that Christianity is somehow inconsistent with modernity and countries becoming more educated, more modern, more scientific would reject Christianity. This has to some degree proven true in Europe, but it's true nowhere else in the world. In fact, the most rapidly modernizing countries in South America, in Asia, India, China, are actually finding religion to be a particularly essential and valuable support on the road to modernity. Now, the atheists in the West know this, and it dismays them because for a long time they were kind of hoping that religion would just wither away. Precisely because religion is faring well, the atheists have upped the ante and launched a sort of direct attack on Christianity. Now, Shermer is about the most affable of all the atheists, so you might believe him when he says, atheism is not a thing. It doesn't have a program, it doesn't have an agenda. But when you read the books of Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and others, Steven Pinker, they say they do have an agenda. Their agenda is to let the religious people breed them, which is to say have the babies, and the atheists say, we who are very powerful in the culture, in the universities, in the schools, will deprogram that religion out of young people. So win them over when they come, if you will, into the atheist camp. Look, if the atheists just didn't believe, you just go about your life as if the whole thing didn't matter. I don't believe in unicorns, but then I haven't written any books called The End of Unicorns. Unicorns are not great. The unicorn delusion, and so on. I just live my life as if there are no unicorns. The very fact that you've got atheist books, atheist conferences, a new atheist radio show, best-selling authors out there, almost an atheist educational program being mounted in the schools, suggests to me that atheism is becoming more self-conscious as a real alternative to Christianity. Those of us who are Christian should realize the people most vulnerable in this are our children, because we raise our children in a religious way, but we often implant religion in them when they're very young. They go off to school and college, and naturally it's difficult to defend those childhood views in the teeth of modern skepticism. So this, to me, is the reason why we need a new Christian apologetics to counter the new atheism. It's not just because we want to go out into the world and preach the message. It's because ultimately we want to protect ourselves and our own children and show them that there is a way to reconcile reason and faith, science and religion, that ultimately Christianity gives us not only a plausible, but also a deeply fulfilling way to live in the modern world today. Thank you.
Michael, you affable atheist, you. We're going to ask you to respond, but when you respond, would you also fold in your closing remarks,
okay.
and then Dinesh will give you a chance to give your closing remarks as well. So, Michael,
Excuse me,
please.
yes, thank you. Back to the question, is religion a force for good or evil? I'll just give you the same answer again because I'm still there. Yes, it depends. Religion is good when it does good and bad when it does bad. So the proof is in the pudding. It's in the doing and what you actually do with religion that matters. It's the only thing that matters. Now, is it winning or losing? Is what winning or losing? Which religion? And, you know, there's a statistical answer you could give, a demographic change, shift, whatever. But that's not the force behind the question. And I don't like the question because it brings us back to that tribal competitiveness that touches those parts of our human nature that are a little on the darker side. The idea that it's a battle and somebody has to win by itself is problematic. It is the exact attitude that all my atheist, secular, humanist, ACLU supporting, whale hugging, tree saving, sandal wearing friends believe, right? We're going to defeat those religious nuts and so forth. This is really a dangerous doctrine also. The idea is, I think, what we want to shoot for is an expanding circle of sentiments to incorporate all people under an umbrella of certain tenets that allow people to believe whatever they want, as long as it doesn't harm other people. Of course, there are delusional beliefs, unicorns, for example, we'd rather dispel people of. And so we publish magazines like Skeptic and Scientific American to say, here's what we know about this or that. But on these big questions that science cannot adjudicate, is there a God? Is there free will? Is there an afterlife? People are going to just have to be able to come to their own beliefs about these questions and then just be left alone. And alternatively, not allowed to enforce them on the rest of us. Chris Hitchens makes a nice point about this, about the dangers of extremism. At least this is the point I think he's making, that unfortunately there are enough people out there who will not be satisfied until every knee is bowed to their particular religion. And so obviously after 9/11 we know who we're thinking about there. So the point I think of the last, say, 400 or 500 years is that it has become more and more okay to diverge from the mainstream belief. It's okay to not believe in God. It's okay to be a woman and still be able to think and vote. It's okay to be black and still enjoy the same rights as everybody else. The circle has been expanding to include more and more people into the in-group that we want to give those rights and liberties to. And I think we have to continue expanding the circle. This is not the place for a debate on gay rights and all that stuff. There was the whole business of the Brights. Let's change our name. Atheism has such a pejorative label to it that we need a new name. So I was at the conference, Atheist Alliance International Conference, when this couple hatched this idea, which when they presented it, I mean, it was a big build-up how, you know, the gays used to be called, you know, fags and faggots and homos and lots of other fairly nasty, non-repeatable names. And they changed the name to gay, and now gay rights, gay pride, so on. It's okay to be gay. So we need a new name. They put up this big word, Brights. And we all laughed because we thought this is a part of a humorous thing, right? No, they're serious about it. And okay, well, let's actually see if anybody who would call themselves bright would actually call themselves bright. So I actually ran a market test on this amongst thousands of non-believers. Like 0.01% said, yeah, I like the word. 99.9% said, I would never call myself that. What an idiotic name. Anyway, so the idea there is the search for what can we do to not call attention to ourselves in a negative way. That's the idea. It's just a marketing idea. In principle, in the long run, so now I'm just about finished with my wrap-up comments and then.
Thank you, sir.
I think the goal, again, is to expand this principle of liberty, as our president talked about this morning. I will lose much street cred among the atheists for endorsing the president's idea of spreading democracy. But as Dinesh points out in his books, he wouldn't say it this way, but it isn't a God-given gift. You actually have to go fight for it. It's the only way to get it, historically. You actually have to go make it happen. It doesn't just happen by itself. The spread of liberal democracy and market capitalism. These are the two best things we can possibly do to expand the circle of sentiments to include all people within the group, because that system allows the greatest amount of diversity without, and attenuates, allows the least amount of violence against people who are different from the mainstream. Those two things, liberal democracy and market capitalism, will not come about naturally. You actually have to go make it happen. So to that extent, to whatever extent we can go out there and do that, whether you can force a people to be a democracy or not remains to be seen in some parts of the world. Other parts it happens quite naturally, like in Japan, as the president mentioned. But that is a good goal to have. And there, once that happens, it doesn't matter which religion you believe in, because under those circumstances, the chances of somebody imposing their beliefs on somebody else through the violence or threat of violence is virtually nil. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Dinesh, your closing remarks.
I want to say again that this has been a little courageous of you, Michael, to come out here and in Nashville, Tennessee, and defend your views, and say what you believe and say why. I've tried to argue that there's more faith in you than you recognize.
Maybe. Yeah.
I want to suggest that there's more agnosticism in us Christians than you recognize. And what I mean by that is this. When I say that I'm a believer, in a sense, I'm confessing that I don't know, because knowledge is different than belief. I believe that there's Australia down there, even though I've never been. But I wouldn't say I believe in my brother. I know the guy. The fact that we believe suggests that there is faith involved. And that means that as Christians, we should be a little humble about what we know and what we don't know. Now, you mentioned several ideas: liberty, the idea of equality, the idea of rights. I want to emphasize that Jefferson, who was, along with Franklin, perhaps the least religious of the founders were in general traditional Christians. Jefferson was more of an enlightened man. He was a Christian, but a bit of a rebel, a renegade. And yet when this man of science, when this man of the Enlightenment, when this man of invention sat down and was asked to articulate for the world in the Declaration of Independence, what is the source of rights? Where do these rights come from? Jefferson ultimately could do no better than to say these rights are the direct legacy of our Creator. He couldn't think of any other source of rights. If he could, he would have said it. So the point here I want to make is all these ideas of human dignity, of liberty, of equality, ultimately have a perhaps hidden, I wouldn't say invisible, because it is visible for anyone with a little bit of historical sense. They have a theological foundation. Historians who look at Western civilization know that this civilization of ours is resting on two pillars, Athens and Jerusalem. Athens in some ways refers to the legacy of Greece and pre-Christian Rome. Remove that. If you remove Socrates, if you remove Athens, our civilization would look different. But even more, if you were to remove the other pillar, which is Jerusalem, our civilization would be unrecognizably different from what it is. Even the institutions of modern democracy, modern capitalism, even modern science are resting on this dual foundation. This, I think, is a common ground for people who are religious and non-religious, because it doesn't take faith to recognize that we have been shaped by a Christian culture. Even now, the assumptions of our civilization are rooted in Christianity. A final point, and that is that there is in our time, I think, a rather distressing and bogus effect to equate Islamic radicalism with Christianity. Even Michael did it implicitly when he said in the days after 9/11, Christiane Amanpour had her special some months ago about God's warriors, the radical Muslims, the radical Christians, the radical Jews. But if you look closely at that special, you notice that there was a flaw in it. Who are the radical Muslims? Bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, the 9/11, the Bali bombing, the London bombing, the Madrid bombing, and so on. Then you come on the Christian side. Where's the Christian Al-Qaeda? Where's the Christian Hamas and Hezbollah? Where's the Christian country ruled today along the lines of Khomeini's Iran? It doesn't exist. And so there was Christiane Amanpour in the hills of Montana looking for the Christian Bin Laden and finding an old guy on a sort of a rocking horse, a guy without any teeth. Here is the guy. He's a Christian, but he wants to blow up the world. It's true he doesn't have a job, but one day when he has a job, he's hoping to have the savings to be very afraid of this guy. And all I'm trying to say is that of late, even some of the new atheists, Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens, have been backing off from their claim that there is some kind of a moral or legitimate analogy between radical Islam and Christianity. That is not true today.
Dinesh, thank you. Let me put a capstone on this, if I can, gentlemen. And I found a great quote from Winston Churchill. He said this, he said, "Truth is incontrovertible. Malice may attack it, ignorance may deride it, but in the end, there it is." The purpose of this debate is to help us learn how to contend for the truth. Dinesh, you talked about Athens. Just as a capstone in all of this, let's turn back the hands of time. And Michael, you're absolutely right. God did write many books, and then he conveniently put them all under one cover, which made it easy for the rest of us. So if we can turn back the hands of time, we'll go to Athens for a moment. This is a great place, the great reasoners, right? The great thinkers of the day. And here we have in the midst of Athens a Jew's Jew, a rabbinical scholar who knew the law inside out and upside down, but he hated Christians, hated them with an intensity that was, well, deadly. But then he hit a moment of enlightenment. And he had this encounter with the living God, as you remember, Michael, on the road to Damascus, and old things passed away and all things became new, and he became a new man. Now, this is not an argument I can put forth at Princeton University, but it's an argument here among ourselves, one that's important, and it reminds us, as the writer of Ecclesiastes said, that there really is nothing new under the sun. So here is this great scholar, and what does he do? He goes up. Well, he goes into the marketplace of ideas, and he's at the synagogue where the great thinkers are of the day, and he's debating with them, the Epicurean, the Stoics. Oh, look, in my version it says graduates of Princeton, Harvard, and Yale. They were all there, and they were contending with him, and they didn't call him poor, uneducated, and easy to command. They called him a babbler. But he was there, but I'll tell you what he was culturally astute, and when he got taken up to Mars Hill at the Areopagus, he looked around and he saw that they were very religious people, and he saw their pagan gods, and as C.S. Lewis says so well, the gods who are not there. But he astutely zoomed in, learning how to be a good apologist, Dinesh, like you're teaching us for the faith, and he saw the pillar with no statue on it, and he said, there, that's the one I represent, the unknown God. And then in brilliance, because he had that kind of a mind, he became a great apologist there on that windy hill, and what he did is he co-opted a poem, probably written by a person from Crete, and he described beautifully our relationship with the living God by saying, in him we live and move and have our being. And before that, he told us this profound truth, that we're not going to find him in a petri dish or in a laboratory, but that this, he said, they should seek God in the hope that they might feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us. And then he reminded us this. He told us very strongly up at that moment on the hill, the times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. Doesn't mean walking up and down Constitution Avenue in D.C. with a billboard sign that says the end is coming, but in a winsome and wonderful way, reminding people that the great judge of us all will give us someday the opportunity to stand before him. So what this passage tells us so wonderfully is that some of the people loved what he had to say. Some of them mocked them. They were knee-jerk, right-wing, reactionary, homophobic members of the religious right. But he got up there and he spoke the truth to them. And what happened as he spoke the truth? Some of them joined him and believed him. Other of them derided him and walked away. Here's what we learned in that Athens experience. That mandate's still the same. Not truth or love. Truth in love. And the purpose of our argument today, our debate today, is to quicken your heart, to quicken your mind. Remember that you honor him not just with your heart, but with your mind as well. and that it isn't a choice of either faith or reason, but that the two are inexorably connected. And I'll end, in deference to you, my dear friend, with a French mathematician. Blaise Pascal said, "We know the truth not only by the reason, but also by the heart." Let's you and I go out into the marketplace of ideas and continue to speak the truth in love, because it is a debate worthy of our attendance. Would you thank our great guests, please?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Absolutely superb, Dinesh. Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael. That was wonderful.
You did a great job. You're the best.
Thank you. I
Nice to meet
appreciate
you.
it. Oh, okay. That means a lot considering where you've been. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
gentlemen.
Thank you.
That's for you. Thank you.